So I guess, hi, good evening all. With Kostis doing the history of the left and me speaking about the center, we just need someone for the right. And
Oh, thank you.
okay.
It's an honor.
Okay.
To present.
Thank you, Antony. Thank you. Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Kostis. So thank you everyone at SEESOX and the European Center. Okay, so now there is the American periodical you wouldn't know, probably, unless you're enthusiasts of that kind of periodical in America called Field and Stream, which in the late 20s contained a review of D.H. Lawrence's brand new novel, Then Lady Chatterley's Lover. And according to the periodical contained this review, which contained the following paragraph. Unfortunately, one is obliged to wade through many pages of extraneous material in order to discover and solve the sidelights on the management of a Midlands shooting estate. Okay, so it's good to remember that, because often with a lecture, especially with political subjects that may involve many people emotionally, and I see quite a few Greeks here and also others, and the Greek crisis is a very emotional topic. I run the risk of making a talk and then hearing that I did not say enough about the Midlands estate, everybody's conception of what is really important in the Greek crisis. But, as you know, I'll be speaking about the Greek public intellectuals of the political center during the crisis. I will, of course, be mentioning the crisis. I will be, of course, mentioning politics, possibly a little economics, but I will not speak about the deep root causes of the crisis, or rather, I will refer to some in the view of this conversation, but not about, the crisis of world capitalism, not about other very interesting things or the plight of Europe. So I'm really concentrating on a narrative of the Greek public intellectuals of the center, the political center. And as often kindly said, I consider myself one of them in the general definition, but this is not autobiographical. Obviously, it is informed by experience as well. Now, my context is the Greek crisis, which began in late 2009. Am I going to give you a Greek narrative? Is the narrative of the crisis a Greek narrative? According to some, it's a special case of an international narrative, or perhaps a special case of a European narrative or a South European narrative. Perhaps you remember the famous, notorious acronym of PIGS and so on. But it is all that, no doubt. There's an international aspect and has to do with the economy in general and has to do with Europe. But to me, the narrative I will give you is a Greek narrative. And that is not just because that is what I want to talk about, which is also sort of reason, but because I think there is something very Greek in the Greek crisis, reasons pertaining especially to Greece. And it is mostly those that I will be referring to, again, and not the Westland state. Now, the Greek crisis is primarily, as we know, it started, and it is mostly in the newspapers and the news as an economic crisis, and secondarily political, social, cultural. In my talk, it will be political, social, cultural, secondarily economic, or rather, I will be putting an emphasis mostly on politics, social aspects, and cultural aspects, and not the economy, about which I knew macroeconomy, at least almost zero, except some Marx I had read back in the 70s. And then practically nothing. And I learned, like many of us, through trying to understand what was going on. But it won't be really my subject. I will speak about CPI. This is a stupid acronym, but to avoid writing it again and again. It is the CPI. Is good. I see Kostis smile. Maybe it reminds him of other more glorious initials, but I will be speaking of the centrist public intellectuals. And these are people who are public intellectuals, though not always intellectuals. By that I mean, of course, that there are people who took a stance, publicly spoke in a way that was rather analytical or somehow intellectual. Some of them would be classified as intellectuals more generally, being writers and political scientists and academics, many writers, most actually, but not all are. There are here in this group some lawyers, some professionals, some executives in the private sector, some people in the public sector who also took the stand and wrote or spoke about the crisis. And that would not be classified as intellectuals, not even as Gramsci's organic intellectuals. Those people, most of the people I was speaking to, but not all, I will go a bit into this later, first appeared or turned to political subjects during or right before the crisis. They were writing about other things, some of them even in newspapers or in blogs or appearing on the television or the radio, but not really politics. Politics became their thing during the crisis. Do not form, I have to stress that, I'm not talking about a group, a party, a parea, we'd say in Greek even, a formal group and no hierarchy, no structure. I'm talking about a group of people who were often have marked similarities in their approach. Their views were mainly marginal, I should also say that, irrelevant for many years. And apart, why am I talking about it except nostalgia, you may wonder, it is something more that are becoming increasingly relevant to political discourse, either through direct attention to them or the influence on others, mainly politicians, adopting or referring to some of those. And the operative word, of course, here is influence. They are becoming less marginal, more, and have some market influence. The reason for this is, I won't tell you the reason for this. I'm a writer, don't forget, we don't do spoilers, so you have to wait. Okay, just to give you some context here. The Greek elections 74 to 2020 over. For those of you who don't know too much about this, I must tell you I've done some things that are not very proper, but they were good for the visuals here. Not to complicate the image too much, the left, that is KK, Communist Party, and what used to be called of the interior, then AR, then various things, then SEESOX, in previous incarnations, were often, here we begin 74, and here at around 99, for 2 years, they run together in elections, the left, the two parties. But I have split their vote when they did by 2. Here, for example, we have the United Left, so we got about 10, so I gave them 5 and 5, and that is not to complicate my graph. What is important is that the left in this period was scoring a bit over 10, either united or in 2 individual parties. For example, here you see a huge rift of the interior, the ex-Syriza previous, the grandfather of Syriza, huge going up to the Communist Party. One could surmise that this here, which would be the United Left, would probably be the same image. In a sense, this tells us that Syriza does not really begin to rise until the 80s, late 80s. Also, the extreme right, as you notice here, is practically non-existent, the black line. The center begins the first post-junta elections. Of course, 74 is the collapse of the junta. And it begins, the center begins as a remnant of the pre-junta left, the Enosi Kendru, Center Union. In the first elections, it does a decent showing, but then collapses with the rise of PASOK, the party of Andreas Papandreou then, the Green Line. And also the center, this is Politiki Annexi, the party formed by Antony Samaras in the early 90s. He declared it the center party, so I list it as a center party, but one could say it's not that. So the center does, dismally during this period. It's pretty close to zero. Not much more to say about this. Then we jump here in our story to December 2008. I call this here a prelude, and it's a year before the crisis. The reason I begin here is because my story begins here, because most or many or a significant number, let me say, not most, of the people that I will generically refer to as the centrist public intellectuals first took a public stand around that period, especially after that period. There were riots in Athens for 4 or 5 days, rioting, looting, excessive destruction, a huge outbreak of anger over the initial cause of it was the assassination, the murder of a high school student by a policeman. There was an enormous reaction, as you know, in riots all over the Western world, especially in the 20th century. Very frequently they begin from a killing by police. You see it here, you see it in America, you see it in Western Europe, and some of us were the reason why some of us, I among them, first began to write about politics or the cultural aspect of politics, history of ideas, you might call it, is that what we saw then as a whole society's reaction to that event, which we thought that in one word was extreme. The policeman was immediately arrested, is now serving a life sentence. There was no negligence on the part of the state in the sense of, ignoring the fact, or as often happens, say, in race killings in America, you have the policeman getting away with it, and that provokes anger. There was none of that here. And what especially puzzled many of us, intellectuals I would call ourselves, if you'll excuse me, was the indifference of, first of all, the fact that the state did not react to this, that they thought that this was a right-wing government, center-right, new democracy, that the best way to face the crisis would do nothing. And secondly, to the intellectuals, most of which were silent, completely silent, or those that did take a stand said, this is something that we must listen to very carefully. They were saying the Greek word is afungrasto, listen very closely and understand the message of what the young people were giving us. Many of us thought that the events in themselves showed an anger and an explosion that did not reveal something very deep and profound about our society, that this was a tragic event, a lamentable, a terrible event, the culprit was punished, but Greece otherwise was one of the thriving Western European countries, most prosperous. The degree of freedom measured by any standards was extremely high. The index of freedom was extremely high in Greece, and to speak of this tragic phenomenon as a sign of a whole society's malaise was, to say the least, wrong. And I was personally, and speak for myself here, but I know many others too, was really angered, not so much, of course, by the, how can you be angered by reactions of a mass of people, a big number of people, but I was angered by a few thousand people, I would say. I was really angered and puzzled by the fact that many people could not see that thing for what it was, which was an outbreak that was not understandable as a deep symptom of society. Now, so with the riots, we have the beginning of the first of the three classes of centrist intellectuals I talk about. I'll call them the old dogs, and I'll show you why. The old dogs are mostly over 50. Mostly not involved in politics since they hadn't been since the 70s. As a rule, belonged to the youth movements of the left at the time of the junta. This was for most of the last political involvement. Since then, mostly non-partisan, non-aligned to parties, mostly intellectuals, academics, and writers. The discourse they developed over the first year or months was critical of much of anti-establishment rhetoric, and so also the left-wing parties, the rhetoric of the left-wing parties, which took the stance that the outbreak of violence in December 2008 was totally understandable and a sign of a deep malaise, but also critical towards the two government parties, center-right and center-left, which controlled about over 80% of the vote, as you saw, and appealing to common sense, the need for a rational examination of what is happening to the country. Then we go to 2009. Here we had the first major fall drop. Here you see New Democracy going down, so goes up, which is sort of normal here, but have a huge drop, and that is partly because the head of the New Democracy Party, during the campaign, said Greece is approaching, we are near an economic crisis, and please give me the mandate to take some measures, essentially to drive the country into an austerity program. We all know how popular that message can be. He was punished accordingly. George Papandreou came to power. Otherwise, not much change here. Nothing really very significant, except the beginning of the rise of the extreme right, probably unrelated to all this rhetoric and having to do with other things that are not the main subject here. Now, the crisis begins during the first months of the Papandreou government. December 2009, Greece's credit rating begins to fall dramatically, and the 23rd of April, to Greeks, the metonymy for it is Kastellorizo, because that's the small island where George Papandreou decided to make the announcement that he was going to ask the IMF and the European Union for an international bailout. Now, of course, as you can understand, immediately the main topic of public discussion in Greece became what caused the crisis. There were various answers. PASOK said that New Democracy. New Democracy said that PASOK. Okay, not too many surprises here. The left said that New Democracy and PASOK, as well as markets, finance, global capitalism, within whose paradigm New Democracy and PASOK were operating. The extreme right said New Democracy, PASOK, the left, the immigrants, the foreigners, the bourgeoisie, and the banks. And some geniuses said that the Minotaur did. And if you can't understand that, it's because you're not a genius. Now, the old dog's unpopular explanation, and it was very unpopular, take it from me, I was there, was that the crisis was to be expected, given the state of the Greek economy. It only took one push from the world crisis for it to collapse. That the economy went hand in hand with the favoritist and clientelist political system. It was created in its image as votes and bribes were exchanged over whole decades for jobs in or handouts and bonuses contracts from the public sector. It had created a capitalism of the crony type. State-sponsored rent-seeking activities were the rule in the economy. Consumption was preferred over production. Imports were preferred over exports. Public sector and state-derived bonuses were preferred over private sector incentives and facilitation. And of course, add to that inefficiency and corruption. Now, I have to say, because I was one of the, I didn't understand, as I said, much economics, so I commented more on the political or cultural aspect of this, which I could see, and many of us then started to not teach ourselves exactly, but learn some economics to try to understand. And I have to say that this was not an original opinion. Two people were saying those things in Greece since the 80s. I would call them the proto-unpopular. The voices in the wilderness. There were the journalist Yannis Marinos and the politician Stefanos Manos, ex-New Democracy, since then founder of a number of small parties, all of which, if you added their score in the elections over 2 decades, you'd probably not get to 10%. And here I would call him the arch-unpopular. Still, to many people, when you want to drive them up the wall, will say Stefanos Manos. And Kostis too, I think. Now, I have to say that this is a very puritanical kind of criticism in certain years. And if perhaps we're talking about it in anthropological terms, it was a sort of the criticism of a guilt culture. Marinos and Manos may have called it more European, of guilt culture, in the sense that we are to blame too for what is happening to us, versus a shame culture. And Greece is in many ways a shame culture. More important is what people say, what people think, the image, than what my conscience tells me as an individual or as a nation. So I think one of the reasons for its unpopularity was that it was trying to find many of the reasons of the causes of all sorts of political problems inside Greece, rather than seeing them all as the reflections of, or more usually, the work of evil powers operating outside Greece. Now, I will recount to you 3 or 4 very brief legends of the crisis. I should call them. Legends of the crisis are metaphors, obviously. They are not, some of them you could have heard of in similar words or variations thereof. I have given them some more structure. These were, some of those were, all of the ideas of those were in the discourse of the centrist public intellectuals. The form I will give to you is my own, very consciously constructed form. I think I give them to you, as I said, as metaphors, as kinds of densifications of certain meanings for which I think metaphors are sometimes more effective than analysis. Now, the pre-legend, the legend that was there before the crisis, was the shock, was the cause for it, the why I will give it to you, is the shock many of us had received over years, but didn't think it was so important. But the shock was many received when we engaged in discussions with many people regarding the economy, and saw the extent to which there was extreme and very basic ignorance among huge numbers of Greeks about the basic mechanism of the economy. So I shall call all my legends have rather shocking and iconic titles. I will call this the monetary, which is the arch legend. And I will read you a poem. The state has a lot of money. The money comes from the monetary. There is no limit to the abundance of the monetary. The government is the guardian of the monetary. The fruit of the monetary, the money, is handled by the government. The government dispenses or keeps the money as it sees fit. Good governments distribute a lot of money. Bad governments don't. Governments consist of politicians. The only reason politicians can have for not distributing the fruit of the monetary is that they want to keep it for themselves or give it to the rich bodies, taking bribes. Good politicians give out a lot of money. Bad politicians keep it for themselves and their bodies. That's why we have elections. Elections were created so we can exchange bad politicians who keep the fruit of the monetary for good ones who give it up. The bad news is that good politicians, when in power, become bad, grow greedy, and keep the fruit for themselves and their rich bodies. The good news is that bad politicians, when in opposition, become good. So we have elections once again. Okay, not a very good poem, but you get the idea. Now, for those of you who are not experts, let's see, that's very brief Greek diction, the crisis dictionary. Crisis, government asks for bailout, troika enters the game. Troika, in newspeak, our present government often likes to change, instead of bothering to change reality, changing the words. Call it institutions, is the European Commission, EU, ESM, the ECB and the IMF agreeing to bail out Greece, signing a memorandum, or mnemonio in Greek, the terms imposed by the Troika, according to which payments of the bailout money are made. There are 3 to date, 3 memorandums, the first in 2010, second, 12, third, 15, and counting. Anti-mnemoniakos, good term and useful, an opponent of the memorandum agreement, though not necessarily for the bailout. Okay, so in the spring of 2010, we have the first memorandum. Before that, you'll notice a second little line here, the blue line. I call those people appearing in public discourse of the center, not the old dogs you'll recall are older, the innocents, who are, I call them that, of course, and not very innocent. And as they were not involved in mainstream politics before, with the exception, some of them, of tiny centrist parties, forums, and so on, mostly amateur intellectuals like professionals, civil sector employees, economists, etc., and who approach phenomena with refreshing common sense, free from ideology and often free from sophistication. Mostly less well-known as public personalities or not at all, many of these operating through social media, often using aliases for reasons of their own. Some that I know, for example, were in the public sector, didn't want to expose themselves with their views. These new people, and the old dogs as well, together are talking a lot about the new subject, the faulty cure. In the setting of the crisis and the first memorandum, a new issue has become fundamental now. Of course, the memorandum agreement, the mnemonium, and the common view in these circles is that the government is mishandling the implementation of the memorandum, ignoring what's best in it, the reforms, and preferring what's worse in it, taxation. Its aim, as perceived by the centrists, is to preserve the status quo, as a name in which it does not disagree with the rest, with the opposition to it, though of course they disagree on the means. They think it should be done through the memorandum by ignoring certain aspects of it, the others by ignoring. I'm showing you this to feel proud, because as I was searching for an article of the great presence of the European Centre and its eminent member here, but really I was looking for this guy. So, but as this came up, I said, I'm at this European Centre, I cannot but show them this wonderful. I have an article in The Guardian back then in 2011, which I had called "It's the Politicians Stupid." Okay? The Guardian, in its infinite wisdom, changed this to "Greece's despair is the product of political ignorance," which slightly overemphasizes a point in the article. And the leader is, to save itself, Greece must realize that its crisis is the result of 3 decades of incompetence and corruption. Again, the Guardian, in its even greater wisdom, said that, shows this picture, to which it gave the legend, although a minority protest, it's a quote from my article, although a minority protest, the majority of Greeks face the crisis by trying to make ends meet. And as you can see, this perfectly illustrates the meaning. Just 2 brief quotes from the article to give you an aura of the kind of criticism. Sorry, I'm quoting from myself, but it was handy to find it in English. What makes ignorance particularly frustrating? I was speaking about political ignorance in Greece. In this case, is that the facts are at our fingertips. Let me give you one. Although 750,000 people, 15% of our workforce, have lost their jobs since the crisis began, not a single one is from the wider public sector, which employs 1 out of 4 Greeks. That's still the case, by the way. Now, actually, and that's the ending of the article, because I was speaking about Socrates a lot in the article. We don't need the bearded old man to tell us the truth about the crisis, but the little boy. For the statement that Greek politicians are to blame is as obvious as the emperor's nakedness in Hans Christian Andersen's famous fairy tale. Now, to many of you here who know about political science and history of political ideas and so on, this smacks of populism. Okay? Is this centrist populism? This is, I view that as a populist critique. It's a populist style critique. That does not make it wrong. Okay? All right. I'm saying this descriptively. It is anti-politicians, anti-party. The politicians are to blame. It's their fault, and that is very much a populist thing. Populists say. You have recent examples in America and elsewhere. But it is not populist, not really, in other aspects, as it is pro-institutions, as populists are, and pro-rational and anti-emotional. Populists tend to be more emotional, and is diametrically opposed to the main populist anti-memorandum rhetoric. The centrist intellectuals is not so much pro-memorandum, as it has been called, but as pro the reforms part of memorandum, which is not being applied. Then there is, I spoke of a prelude and a turning point for the country, which was in May 2011 with the Greek indignados, the Aranaktismeni, gathering in Syntagma Square. In itself, it came after the Spanish, before that the Arab Spring and so on, but there was something, those of you who are Greeks know that this is not a high, but called the Munza, an offensive gesture towards the parliament and its members, the politicians, as it were. And what was interesting there was that 2 movements, or rather 2 political parties, became movements and acquired mass appeal. And there was a distinction back then. We spoke often of the Panoplatia, the upper square, which was the extreme right, the Nazi right, in fact, turned into the Golden Dawn. The lower square, which was mostly the left, and Syriza, as we know, was extremely active in the square. You see that they're very careful never to use a flag, never to use a banner signal, unlike the less experienced extreme rightists, at least in this day and age. And there is something that's happening after the Indignados, after the Anarchismen. The second legend of the crisis is the pill of Blaui, and this is inspired by the great Czesław Miłosz, who wrote a book in the early 50s called The Captive Mind, which has a chapter called The Pill of Multibing. I recommend that you read it. This is my second legend. The story I will tell you appears in a non-existent novel called, I think, Excitability. This is written by a non-existent author whose name I don't recall, but it has many syllables with clear flat vowels and ends in Opolos. The action of the novel takes place on a planet called Grayscalius, where no colors exist. Now, as anyone who has seen a black and white film knows that it is black and white in name only. In reality, most of the images are in various tones, shades, if you want, of grey, with rare splotches of actual white or black. And so was this planet Grayscalius, a grey world. In the past, however, this world was not grey. In the past, in the old days, the world was black and white. In black and white, black, black, white, white, or at least that's what some history books say. The people of Grayscalius were originally quite grey. But after a few decades of particularly good harvest, the people were fed well, became wealthier, safer, and more comfortable, and also more grey. And not just that. With time, it was as if a range of visible grey, both on the people and on anything around them, was becoming narrower and narrower, and the differences between the various tones of grey becoming less and less distinguishable, everything tending more and more towards some common, drab, horrible grey average. Now, the more the world became grey, average grey, the more the citizens of Grayscalius craved for black and white. Ah, black and white. Ah, the joys of white, and oh, the horrors of black. Back in the old days that the young people dreamed of, when they heard the older folk who said that they remembered the long past of war, of poverty, of hardship, and the past in the history books where black threatened to dominate reality. And so those opposing it became white in contrast and rose against it. Everyone who fought for white back then had a great time, full of thrills and adventure. Some people fell in the struggle, of course, but at least they became great heroes. The younger folk who heard of this dangerous yet oh so interesting world felt envious of the older folk. Some turned to reading history in order to learn more about black and white times. Some preferred the lures of art and poetry which sang about them. The less studious and less artistic turned to alcohol and imagined black and white in their drunken revelries. Everybody missed black and white. Does the word missed surprise you? Well, it shouldn't. Read Excitability, if you can find a copy, and you will understand. For according to its author, this Apostolos fellow, all people on Doxiadis, even those having grown up in conditions of near totally average grayness, remembered black and white from their childhood. You see, the vision of Grayscalian children is not sophisticated enough. Their eyes are not actually adapted for grey. And so the illustrators of children's books there have to change everything they portray to suit them. But those stories, those black and white stories that Grayscalians read as children, survive somewhere deep in their brains. And as they grow up, occasionally come to them in dreams. In these, there are terrible monsters, all black, but also beautiful heroes and angels, all white. And back to the present, the terrible present of excitability. The planet Grayscalius was sinking into further and further grayness. The old speaking of blacker and whiter times, the young imagining black and white in their art, in their dreams, and in their drunkenness. But then something happened. A great inventor, a pioneer chemist, whose name I don't recall, invented a pill which he called Blaui. The pill came in small capsules. The moment you took one of these, suddenly the world reappeared as it was in your dreams and your nightmares, in the history books and in the fairy tales you read as a child, in full black and white, with absolutely no grey at all. As you can imagine, Blaui was a smashing success. It made its manufacturers incredibly rich, so rich in fact that the state decided it should not allow them to grow any richer and took over the means of production of Blaui and started to manufacture it in state factories. Well, the pill of Blaui, of course, did not change the actual, visible world of Grayscalius. No pill can do that. But it changed people's way of seeing. Was the world too grey for you? Blaui made it incredibly, astonishingly black and white. Eventually, everyone was on Blaui, and the state, being so caring and mindful of its citizens, now started manufacturing Blaui daily in a new form, which citizens could take every day. With a single little pill every morning, the people of Grace Kelius were now constantly living in black and white. They lived wonderful, exciting lives now. Until they started to fight one another over what was black and what was white. You see, that was one of the side effects of the pill. It made some people see as white what others saw as black, and vice versa. And then, well, they all died happily ever after. Now, this was something that, as a metaphor, we saw happening. We saw something, suddenly, the Greek political scene becoming demonological, becoming the landscape of angels and demons. A new rift now divided Greek political, social, cultural life. Left and right, for the public intellectuals of the center, became less important in their analysis, especially so as many of the parties of the extreme right and the left agreed on many things in their criticism of the memorandum and the pro-memorandum parties, e.g. treason, for example, is a common theme in their rhetoric. The CPIs are now also targeted as the anti-mnemoniaki, Germano-Doxiadis, with whistling collaborators from the time of the German occupation. Populism now becomes the central notion of the CPI's critique. We have a third class now. I'll call them the politicians. As a rule, those are also older, and again, like the old dogs, belong to the left during the junta, but either stayed there, usually stayed for about a decade, because they were more or less a group, and not an organized group, but a group, they all knew one another well, then moved to PASOK during the 80s and 90s, or some later. Now, in the spring, with the collapse of the first PASOK government, the coalition government, a new memorandum. And here is when you see it's not by chance that they are green, whereas red and blue here are not really that emblematic, that symbolic. Are the green, the third class, the politicians come in and join in the chorus of centrist type criticism. And I call it centrist here because it criticizes both sides. And of course, the CPIs, the older ones, the old dogs, and the blue ones, the innocents, begin to lose some of their previous aversion to all and every politician. In that sense, they grow up. You know, perhaps they see that politics needs politicians. Perhaps now they see politicians in their midst, in their crowd, and say, maybe some of those guys are beginning to see what's going on. And then we have the Greek elections of May 2012, as you can see that picture in itself says a million words. The collapse of both parties which supported, especially in New Democracy since the spring, the memorandum. The rise, I have added here the three parties of the extreme right, but if I add Syriza and the KKE, we have the left, total of the left being a bit under 30%, total of the extreme right being in the low 20s. And the two government parties collapse, having a brief lead, a small lead for New Democracy, even over Syriza. This is the period when, because of this extreme remedy, the rise of extremes, people started to speak of a, perhaps, you know, in an exaggerated way, but you can see what they meant, a Weimar, sort of Weimar atmosphere in Greece. Now, you can see that the Drasi, which is and the another two small centrist parties, called the brilliant 3.15%, which shows you how greatly influential the ideas of the centrist intellectuals were. Till then, we have a parliament which is completely split, and immediately new elections which will be held in June. Now, for the first time, you see very few differences here between the various groups of the three centrist factions, because now they're all afraid, I would say, of Syriza coming to power. They have a partly demonological, well, partly wrong, as the last year and a half has proven, image of what is really going on at Syriza. They perceive it as much more ideological than it is, in fact. And they see it as an expression of extremism and populism, which they together criticize. So in this period, there are really no disagreements. And of course, as I said, this is very schematic, okay? There are disagreements everywhere, even between these arrows here. It's just that there are tendencies. And then in June 2012, again, from this huge drop, we go up. We tend to approach a new, perhaps two-party system. Greece was two-party here, more or less. Here it's almost there, with Syriza and New Democracy taking the lead, and center extreme right going down. One must wonder where those went. The KK goes down, we know where those went, they went to Syriza. The center stays more or less indifferent. Then we have a coalition government. This is a wrong map because it has the mark here. The rather moderate left party should be here in terms of the old French spectrum. And there is can you see, a rather centrist government in that old sense. Here we have Golden Dawn, here Anel, extreme right, here this is a map taken from the web. This is the Communist Party, and of course here Syriza, who is now the opposition, the main opposition party. I won't read the final myth, legend, the third myth to you because it's 2 pages. Here it says that in the past there was a beautiful land inhabited by beautiful, clever and smart people, and then the enemy started to attack the land and coveted everything beautiful that we had. They could not win against us were it not for the traitors, but there were always traitors, and then the enemies could triumph. But in every period of occupation, a leader arose, a bright young fellow who incarnated all the virtues of the part of the political system, of the people, and led the people to a brilliant victory, thus the people fulfilled their destiny. Often we heard resonances of that mythology in a lot of the critique of the populist critique, and of course crucial here is, and that's why I present this legend here, is the notion of the leader, okay? The bright young star, the man who can bring hope to the people. And of course we have here the sense of small Greece fighting this huge monster here, a small brave fellow, and as we all know, if you ever have such a contest, the outcome will be this. So we have here the legends of the crisis, the David and Goliath syndrome, small Greece fighting the terrible giant of Europe and international capitalism. And of course the last legend is that there is a solution which is somehow magical to this. You know, not only do you have a leader, but you have wisdom, and through the wisdom of the wise man, the leader can acquire beautiful solutions which will save every problem, and we know who the magician was in this case.
Which one of the two?
This one. That's the leader. Well, you know, if a leader believes in magic, there's an element of magical thinking there. And this was promoted as the main line of Syriza at the time was, it's very easy, we'll do it. Now, the Greek elections, as you know, of 2015 brought Syriza to power, but not just Syriza. I keep reminding people that and annoying them. There was a coalition of left and extreme right. New Anel is an extreme right party. They don't like to hear it, they don't like to say it, they call themselves center-right, but they are an ultra-nationalistic, chauvinistic, extremist populist party. And that those two parties collaborated, confirmed a lot of the criticism of people who were closer, most of them not aligned, but closer to these parties, saying that extremism and populism is a more important notion than right or left. And as if we needed proof of that, we have the coalition government still ruling the country after 2 elections. And then, of course, here we had a seminal event, which was the referendum. And during this period, a month before, and during the referendum, all people, the people in what they call the center never felt as united, which in the movement we can call Menum Evropi, will stay in Europe, which had a common rhetoric saying that this government is promoting an anti-European agenda, when the referendum occurred, and we had not the question of the rhetoric of the referendum so much. Should we sign this agreement, which was, of course, we interpreted it as practically a coup d'etat, practically an affront to democratic functioning. I don't think this could pass in this country. I mean, a government could not announce that it's holding a referendum in a week's time on a subject that was not in people's mind as such until then, and asking people whether they have an opinion on a 300-page document in a foreign language. We thought that that was an affront to democracy, and that was one of the reasons that made many people who were pro-yes in the referendum become very close to one another. After the referendum, of course, there were variations. And then, of course, brilliantly, the government signed the memorandum, which was practically the one that had taken to a referendum, and the people voted against. It signed that as if the outcome of the referendum was yes, without any form of self-criticism as to why they did it. And after that, I would say there's been a series of concessions. This is two days ago, the two leaders of the ruling parties setting red lines, as they call them, retreating constantly. We're at about this stage now. And of course, criticism is quite easy. Now, some tentative conclusions. The crisis has given a serious shock to the post-junta metapolitics paradigm of Greek politics. It has also caused a long overdue questioning of the traditional definitions of right, left, center, left, socialist, liberal, as well as labels such as popular, progressive, and democratic as they apply to partisan policies. The old, essentially two-party system has become, after a reshuffling, a weaker form of same, but with important new, smaller players. Though it is too much to say that this marks a re-entry of new ideas, or let's say new, positive, creative ideas in politics, it is true that real issues are now being discussed anew, a bit, but they are. And there are, of course, new ideas, but some horrible new ideas, like Nazism. Some tentative conclusions more. On the positive side is the progress towards the debunking of many of the crisis and pre-crisis non-rational mythological views of political reality, especially as to how the economy and political action work, and I've referred to those myths as the legends of the crisis. On the negative side is that extremism has become a much more significant force, both the extreme extremism, let me call it that, of, for example, Golden Dawn Party, but more perniciously, because more invisibly, extremist discourse within mainstream parties. The existing electoral system, giving the first party an extra bonus of 50 seats, 50 parliamentary seats, has been a determining fact. We must say this, because discussion on politics also involves institutions and not just ideas and people in all recent developments, and a driver towards polarization and extremism. That is an undeniable fact. And the roles of the centrist public intellectuals in this crisis is that from its beginning, they have been instrumental in raising basic questions about the polity, economy, government, and parties, questions almost completely ignored in the past, as they were ignored in the first years of the crisis, while those who expressed them were ridiculed, bullied, or worse. Though generally criticized and maligned, and generally unsuccessful in aiding in the formation of a new or new style political parties, the centrist intellectuals have been crucial in keeping the flag of rationality alive in the midst of chaos, fanaticism, and extremism. Their views, publicly expressed over 6 years, have created a sort of legacy that is now very present in political discourse. And I just hope that this legacy could be useful to the country in the future. There are some of those people I'm here too. And I was amazed at how many I could find that I would definitely list. I have not included politicians, and I have not included journalists, except some opinion columnists, but not professional journalists or professional politicians. And I would probably fit in a few more, if I could, I would put a few more dozen, which gives you an impression of the kind of group this is, or informative. So, that's it. Thank you very much.
was difficult to come up with a response because I had no script or no manuscript to work on. But listening to Apostolos, I made some free associations. I tried to remember points from the past, and I won't go into detail about certain details that one would narrate in a different way. My overall impression, and this is a critical start, is that there's a narrative of which avoids self-criticism in this story. I mean, we've heard the story of those who were in the forefront, and they were cautioning Greek society in advance, and Greek society was not ready to listen to their opinions. It is interesting, in the radical left, we have a similar dialogue to the radical left, as you might have guessed by now. We have a similar tendency to understand ourselves as being in the forefront, we're the avant-garde, and sometimes, now after the capitulation of Syriza, there's this commonplace among the circles of the Greek left intellectuals, I told you so. Oh, Syriza would capitulate, I told you so, you were not listening. And I'm afraid that this narrative, in a way, has this I told you so. In Greek, there's a new word for this, it's stalegakias, staelera, that in a way needs to be re-examined. What I see here, and I think that this is the most positive outcome of the crisis, is the radicalization of the intellectuals. We see a group of people that through the crisis go through a process of radicalization, and I think this is what, if there is a positive outcome of the crisis, is that it has emancipated all of us from the constraints of the past. I grew up, and the Apostolos is just a bit older than me, but in an era where there was an overall consensus that that the post-1974 Greece is taken to be granted. We have social stability, economic stability. There are some problems, but they are not structural problems. And up to a point, one can be a leftist or rightist, and this is more an issue of aesthetics. Because at the end of the day, we will all go and listen to Theodorakis and remember our glorious days when we were rebels. An overall consensus that I think avoided the real issues. And this group of intellectuals, the centrist intellectuals, emancipated themselves from their own constraints because they are the byproducts, biological byproducts sometimes, of the Metapolitevs era, of the post-1974 era. And I think they went through a process of radicalization which is more than welcome and I think has contributed to the public discussion. So my one possible first question is whether we should stick to the centrist term, or is it liberalism? There's always a problem in Greek politics of adopting liberalism. It's the same with the American, the condition. But I think that here we're not referring to the restoration of the old centrist 1950s, 1960s politics. We're talking about a step forward. Centrism, in my view, is a retreat to the past, whereas here we have a step forward. But the precondition for all this process is the re-examination of the past. And I think that here we should focus more on the old dogs and to discuss their genealogy, how they appear in the Greek setting, and how I would emphasize the fact that they belong to the 1970s generation that was heavily invested or engaged with politics of the left. I think that we should see the Greek case as ascribing to the broader transformation of public intellectuals in the post-1968 world, and how you have the radicals of the 1970s gradually abandoning their previous beliefs and re-examining their own past. So I think that we shouldn't say that this appeared out of the blue, because you said that sometimes that these people were not engaged in politics or they would not write about politics. It's partially true, but they bring political baggages with them, or most of them. And here I think we have to acknowledge, and I would like to know what you think about this, that this is a generation that was defined by this post-1974 consensus, and up to a point took part in the construction of this world, and up to a point was socially developed and socially evolved in this era. So the crisis, this is not a 20-year-old a generation of 20-year-olds radicals appearing on the scene. We have people that have been part of the social and political consensus of the post-1974 era, which brings me to my next point, which has to do with this idea whether these centrist intellectuals are marginal or they're seminal in the Greek public debate. And I agree with Apostolos that at some points they appear to be very marginal. But on the other hand, there's a paradox here. Although if one takes the main journals where these intellectuals write, the rallying points, the Athens Review of Books is one of those, the Books Journal is the other one. One can detect a narrative of persecution or marginalization, your question exactly. I mean, the idea that society is against us, that we are attacked, and it is true, and sometimes, the internet is a very nasty place for debate, and no one has really survived from this climax of using very heavily charged words. I mean, during the memorandum, both sides were exchanging insults like it was, the final battle, the latest struggle. But are they so marginal? Are they persecuted? Are they really, again, reminding us of the extreme left that has this idea that we are surviving because we carry the true message here? I think there's a paradox here. On the one hand, they do appear peripheral. On the other hand, they were seminal and pivotal in the politics of the late 1990s and the modernization politics of PASOK, many of those. And I think I would invite you to be more self-critical of the transformation of these intellectuals, which should see their role in the institutions. If we have the faces, these are familiar faces, these are our colleagues. They all write in influential newspapers, they belong to institutions, they're not marginal. They're not dissidents like being in Eastern Europe in 1968, or in the 1950s in Stalinist Poland. So here we have a central paradox of what I would say is the central paradox of liberalism in Greece. It always feels excluded, but it is always present in the areas where we have the main debate. I mean, who was really minority in 2004 during the Olympics? Who was minority when the days of the glorious, Greece being the most successful state of the Balkans, or Greece being, winning the European Cup. I mean, who was a minority at that point? Was this generation of intellectuals? They are intellectuals without a party, that's true. But at the same time, they do have a rallying point, and this is my last point. And their rallying point, I think, is what Schlesinger wrote in 1947, is the vital center. This idea that we should defend the existing social order against the extremes. And the Apostolos mentioned that in passing, this debate about the Weimar Republic. And I think we should focus more on what this group was actually saying, because sometimes we missed this point. I mean, what was the real argument? I mean, the centrist intellectuals made about the future of democracy in Greece, for instance. Well, what is their main argument regarding the refugee crisis? We have a narrative. This is the new. This is innovative. This goes beyond the old. But we really have to focus on certain examples, I think, in order to make this contrast more visible. And my main example is this discussion about the Weimar Republic. When I was back in Greece at that point, it was surprising to see how popular it became. It was there. I mean, it started from intellectuals. Then it was part of the parliamentary debate. Winkler's work on the Weimar Republic, the German historian, became one of the bestsellers of the era. And this was the idea that we have a republic, and the two extremes, the extreme left and the extreme right, the extreme left being Syriza at that point, are creating chaos in the streets of Athens, and this will eventually lead to an unpredictable scenario. And I think, and this is my last point, that the centrist intellectuals there lost an opportunity because they appeared to be defending a declining political system against the rise of the extremes, whereas one would imagine that they would become the forefront of a new political formation or a new political slogan to transform Greek society. They had They tried with Potami, and many of you have tried that. You're present in the room. That's a good thing. But they were hesitant, and even this, fragmentation of the small liberal parties in 2012. You have two small liberal parties for the first time gaining 3%, and they do not gain any representatives in the parliament because they do not agree on something. Isn't this a reproduction of the old type politics that these liberal parties wish to transform? And my final point question is the myth of the magical solution. There's no magical solution. But my question is, if there's no magical solution, and we agree on that, then all this fixation or all this strong belief in the common sense, isn't that a magical solution itself? Isn't there a problem there by saying that there's a common sense to all problems? The Greek society was not receptive enough to this idea of common sense, and that we are the ones who have a solution, and the solution is so easy to become, followers of the big common sense party. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
I should tell you that Kostis was my personal choice. As he well knows, as discussant, I invited him to be discussant, and I did because I know that he's an intelligent and honest man, and I like him, and knew that he would be critical and disagreeing, but that he would do that in a way which is useful and express himself very well, and it gives me an opportunity to, first of all, some of you to agree with another, would see another point of view, and perhaps to me to answer some well-put, intelligent questions. So, thanks for me. Let me start with the last. Common sense is not very common. We all know that. Okay? So, I do not think I will try, and it's difficult for you, maybe when you see it on video, if you're patient enough to talk, but I tried during this talk to make it as narrative as possible, as descriptive as possible, not making too many value judgments except at the very end. And Kostis tells me I did not succeed in that. Maybe he's right. It was my intention to describe to you what was happening, really, and not to take a very strong position. Regarding common sense, I do believe that very strongly that common sense cannot be the program of a political party. First of all, because we saw what has happened in the past. No one would vote for it. So, and one of my favorite works of political philosophy ever is Michael Oakeshott's Rationalism in Politics, which says that in fact there is no rationalism in politics. And so, fully with you there, but still what I said was that, and I still believe that common sense is we cannot have too much of it in politics, because it's not possible, but we can have too little of it. So the appeal to common sense was important in these people as a tool of criticism and a tool of looking at some of the foundations of the issues that were never talked about, like common sense is define your terms. Common sense is if you are quoting facts, are the facts true? Okay? So that kind of common sense, I think that was there and was useful in that sense. I'm going backwards. New political formation, I have participated in at least one, somebody else has participated in at least one, and then we both participated in Potami as minor players. There were attempts, but frankly, and this is a more general answer here to the word which we have used between ourselves, two words in discussions are utopia and romanticism. And I think that most of us in the centrist, I call them, I will speak about liberal, intellectuals grew from romanticism to a non-romanticism, not to an anti-romanticism, grew from a utopianism to a non-utopianism. We grew very realistic and very minimalistic in our demands of politics. When we were out of politics, no, but I'll leave this last. Now, regarding the vital center, yes, there is a defense of that. I don't know exactly how Schlesinger means the term, but very much so. Yes, we were, in a sense, saying that our society, we're not looking at it as utopians and not looking at it as romantics. Its institution, its belonging to a sort of Western democratic model is in the right direction with infinite mistakes, infinite misgivings, but that generally it is something to be defended. And of course, regarding our polity and its evils, I've sent you in the past, I think, one of my articles. If you look at some of my articles, I sound like, at 62, like an angry young man. And most of that criticism, especially before 2012, most of it was against New Democracy and PASOK, because the left was really irrelevant. Invitation to self-criticism. I could go on and on with self-criticism, both of those ideas and what happened in this period. But I would be self-critical. For example, one hint of it was in the initial populist position that all politicians are rotten. I'm not saying that they're necessarily not, but I'm saying that politics in, alas, whatever, what can I say, is the realities done, created, performed by politicians, and if you say all politicians are scum, well, then who do you want to do your politics? So there was, I refer to a populist, anti-political position, and of course, it's easy, if you're not involved, Kostis, I think, if you're not involved in actual politics, if you don't do the politics, if you don't want power and take power, even worse, it's very easy to remain easily critical of everything, and you do not perhaps sometimes have to be self-critical, because you can twist and change like Proteus shapes and always be in the right when you're criticizing. So because this was roughly a critical movement, I think self-criticism is required, but not really required in the sense that we were pointing at things that are wrong with the others, and that's a necessary function in the society. Those, if for example someone is in a political party and wants to take power, then they can criticize the program. But as you know, all programs before parties take power are perfect. They have a great degree of perfection. If you are judging really politics as applied, you should judge power. Now, the attacks on both sides, I think that's a bit unfair, in the sense that you're right, the internet is a vicious place, you're right about all that, but I do not know any case of physical violence performed by members of the center against members of the radical left or the radical right. I know of many instances, I'm one of them, of violence from the other side, physical violence. We do not think of people as traitors. Of course, now, if you go to the internet, we call people Yidia, the followers of Syriza, Yidia, goat, stupid, dum-dums. But I have not used that expression, but, no one is called a traitor, and no one is called a quisling, no one is called a collaborator or an assassin. And we were called all those things. So I will argue that, I will disagree with you. The degree of passion and negative emotion was much stronger against the centrists. Now, what is the role of this generation? That's a crucial question. As you know, in Greece, there is a lot of saying the γενιά του Polytechnic generation of the Polytechnic, the anti-junta resistance generation, is to most people anathema. It's a terrible generation. They're a disaster. They are what created this mess. I think that this criticism, to the extent that it is correct, of course, if you look at the ages of our politicians, many belong to that, is fair or not, but to be discussed very seriously if it is addressed to the politicians who were actively involved and belong to that generation, and there are a few dozen of them. Mind you, most are in the left. If we make a list of 50 together, of those who were very active against the junta and were involved in politics afterwards, most 80% are in the left. So I'm not returning the criticism, but there isn't so much involvement of this generation in active politics. The people who were here represented to me some of the things that were best in post-junta Greece, in the sense of creativity, in the sense of entrepreneurship, in the sense of academic work, in the sense of science, in the sense of the arts. And one of the reasons those people, most of those people, were not in politics before, what unites the first two groups of politicians and people I spoke to here, which are definitely the most numerous. If you look at this picture I had here, probably 90% of them, or 95 are in that, is that they had no political activity between the junta and now. Now, I do not consider it
If you want to hear some
yeah,
opinions.
one last point on liberalism. I don't consider it a criticism that we were not active in politics, because I think that we were active socially in society and creative. And one of the reasons, of course, we were not active in politics is that we saw it as something that we didn't want to take part in, and we could not make a difference in unless we became part of the game, and we didn't want to be politicians. And I think not to want to be a politician, we are not ancient Athenians after all, you know. It is not stigma, it is not, we are not achristi or axisti, or if we don't participate in active politics. Not to be a politician is to me no worse than not wanting to be a gynecologist or wanting to be a civil engineer. You know, it's a profession in our society, those who want it do it. Now finally, most important, center versus liberal. Center, I grant you, is a notoriously vague term, but at least everybody knows it's vague. The problem with liberal is when you say liberal, it probably means three different things to people in this room, or 10, if there's something different in America, in a Republican American, a Democrat American, in an English member of the Conservative Party, and a follower of the Lib Dems, in a Greek. To some in America, liberal means practically a communist. In certain circles in Greece, in many circles, liberal means therefore a neoliberal, therefore practically a fascist. So because it is very much charged emotionally, I did not use it. I will happily call myself a liberal in the sense of believer in the values of liberal democracy, and many of my peers in this group would. But it was a conscious decision to make this as neutral as possible, and not to have people thinking critically from moment one, what is a liberal? And of course, many of the people here would not define themselves as liberals.